acompañar el día de hoy. Es un día complicado de final de semestre y demás. Pero el día de hoy estamos recibiendo la visita de la doctora Eva Jablonka en el marco de los seminarios que organiza la Academia de Evolución para enriquecer la vida académica de nuestra facultad. Fundamentalmente, vida académica, dicho de paso, tiene que transcurrir en torno a los estudiantes. Las personas estudiantes, y por ende la docencia, son en última instancia la razón de ser de la UNAM. A veces eso se les olvida a las autoridades al punto de no pagar el trabajo que enseñan en las aulas. Y entonces siempre es importante recordar que la actividad principal de las facultades, y de esta facultad en particular, pues es la docencia. Entonces por eso nos da mucho gusto que haya muchos estudiantes aquí, para ustedes estar dirigiendo esta plática. Y la plática de hoy forma parte de una visita más amplia que Eva Jablonka y Ana Seligovska, que está por aquí, Seligovsky, han realizado en las últimas 2 semanas. En el marco de esta visita han estado haciendo toda una serie de trabajos de campo, visitando jardines biológicos, esfuerzos, digamos, que ocurren a pequeña escala en distintas partes del país. Lo mismo en Viesca, en Coahuila, en Cuatro Ciénegas, en espacios como la visita ha sido posible gracias a las asistencia del compañero Jorge González de Celis, que está aquí a mi lado, y por supuesto a la compañera Angélica Cervantes, de Mónica, claro, Mónica, y de la compañera Angélica Cervantes, que es la coordinadora de la Academia de Evolución de nuestra facultad, a quien le agradecemos mucho el trabajo que ha hecho, al igual que a Jonathan y a Iris, que hicieron posible salir en la Gaceta, y nos han apoyado siempre para la realización de estos seminarios por parte de la Academia de Evolución. Por supuesto, siempre es un gusto contar con la distinción y calidez de Eva, quien ya nos ha visitado en varias ocasiones y nos ha compartido desde sus aportaciones a la síntesis extendida de la teoría evolutiva hasta su interpretación en torno a la vigencia del trabajo clásico de Engels, vergonzosamente tapada por un cortinero que no debería existir en primera instancia en el auditorio de esta facultad. Son murales que están catalogados como parte del patrimonio Fernández Delgadillo. Puede no gustarnos estéticamente, sé que hay una persona que dirige aquí el comité de buen gusto del arte de la facultad y emite opinados juicios de forma qué morales son correctos y cuáles no, pero deberían estar expuestos, ¿no? Eva presentó hace no mucho en el stage su interpretación en torno a la vigencia del trabajo clásico de Engels, titulado El papel del trabajo en la transformación del mono en hombre, un seminario en línea durante la pandemia. Antes de eso, acompañó los esfuerzos de las comunidades zapatistas en el Conciencias, allá en el año 2016, a distancia. Entonces, es una vieja conocida y amiga de nuestro país, pero en particular de la facultad. La doctora Jablonka nació en Polonia, creció y vive y trabaja en Israel, donde estudió biología y una maestría en microbiología en la Universidad de Gurión, así como su doctorado en genética por la Universidad Hebrea de Jerusalén. Los intereses, las líneas de investigación de la doctora Jablonka incluyen la herencia, la genética, la biología evolutiva, la ecología de la conducta, la biología del desarrollo, así como la historia de la genética y la filosofía de la ciencia. Actualmente Eva es investigadora del Instituto Cohn para la Historia y la Filosofía de las Ciencias y las Humanidades, que es parte de la Universidad de Tel Aviv, donde ha desarrollado actividad docente. Eva es autora de decenas de artículos de investigación y junto con Marion Lau es autora de algunos de los libros más relevantes en torno al papel evolutivo de la combinación genética, la epigenética y otras formas y niveles de causalidad de la ampliación de los intervalos de variación posibles en la naturaleza. Ustedes conocen que Eva es autora de herencia epigenética y evolución, la dimensión lamarckiana, transiciones animales, la herencia conductual de la evolución en 4 dimensiones, variación genética, epigenética, conductual y simbólica en la historia de la vida, transformaciones del lamarquismo, de los estudios sutiles a la biología molecular, la evolución del alma sensible, el aprendizaje y los orígenes de la conciencia, que es parte de lo que va a estar hablando el día de hoy. En esta ocasión, y me refiero a la ocasión larga de las últimas 2 semanas, la visita de Eva y Ana ha incluido la presentación el día de ayer de la traducción al castellano del libro Picturing the Mind, en coautoría con Simona Ginsburg. Como toda su obra, este trabajo es un trabajo que es un producto colaborativo, pues como veremos, gran parte de la conciencia pasa por la relación entre colectivos de seres humanos. El día de hoy, la doctora Jablonka nos presentará la aproximación que junto con Simona Ginsburg ha desarrollado para el estudio de la conciencia, abordando la concepción y la metodología subyace en dicha aproximación. Se trata del argumento en torno al papel de lo que ellas han llamado aprendizaje asociativo ilimitado como marcador evolutivo de la aparición histórica de la conciencia. El libro del que se deriva esta plática, The Evolution of the Sensitive Soul, es de nueva cuenta un producto de una fértil triada, en la que la médica y investigadora Ana Celis, que nos acompaña aquí en el auditorio, contribuye al desarrollo de los conceptos a través de su arte. Dicho esto, pues solamente me resta decir que es un honor para nosotros como Academia de Evolución, como Facultad de Ciencias en general, contar con la compañera y amiga Eva Jablonka, a quien le damos la bienvenida a esta la Facultad de Ciencias de la UNAM.
Thank you very much. And I'm very honored to be here, very happy to be here again in UNAM and to see other faces and people that are interested in evolutionary biology. I'm going to talk here about the kind of kernel of way of thinking of an approach that I developed with my friend, Simona Ginsburg, cannot be here, she's sick, and with Anna Jadwiga. And also with many other people, because every work that one does, especially work that takes so much time, like our work, we wrote the book, The Evolution of the Sensitive Soul, 12 years. It always involves a lot of people, a lot of students, a lot of colleagues, a lot of discussion. So every such thing is a collective enterprise. And if I say I don't mean I mean we. But it's when I say we, it's not the royal. I know the they can never be blessed. But I just mean we, the collective that thought about these things. So I wanted particularly Simona, who can be here, and I thank Anna, who's pictured many of the pictures that you will see here, sort of accompany this talk. So what I'm basically an evolutionary biologist, and the way that I think about problems is from an evolutionary perspective. So when there is a problem, for example, what is life or what is consciousness, I'm talking now about big problems, but it doesn't have to be this problem, any kind of problem. I address it from an evolutionary perspective. I try to understand how this kind of way of being, if we think about life, if we think about consciousness, came to be. How did it evolve? This is how I think about it, and through this, I was conscious among living organisms. And there are also ideas about the possibility of consciousness in machines, in artifacts that we are building. But what I'm going to concentrate on is on biological consciousness and on the origination of this consciousness, assuming that it is that it appeared in evolution. And when we started thinking about it, when we decided to go to study this problem from an evolutionary and biological point of view, from a biological point of view, a scientific point of view, we were stuck. It's a very difficult question. Why are we conscious? I mean, why are we not zombies? Why are we not, like in the washing machine? You press here, something comes out there. Why? Why do we feel? Why do we see red? Why do I see faces? Why don't I just respond to inputs? Input, output, reinforcement, very simple. Why? What is it all about? How to think about this? There is a category difference between conscious and non-conscious being. So how can we bridge this category gap? Through science, through biology. Some people think you can't do it. You can't do it. It's impossible. It's a category mistake even to try. Now, when we started thinking about it, we thought, well, what is a similar problem in biology that was also thought to be insoluble within the scientific paradigm, but turned out to be possible through an evolutionary approach. And the kind of problem that we thought was most similar to the problem of consciousness, not the same, of course, but similar in terms of the problematics of that we saw, was the origin of life. How did life evolve from non-life? Here too, we have a category difference between two modes of being, the non-living and the living. And how did people think about it? How did it become a scientific problem? A problem that is approachable by science, and especially by evolutionary biology, and also evolutionary chemistry. So we looked at theories of the origin of life, and we found one theory which seemed to us very good methodologically for the problem that we have been dealing with. And we adopted the methodology of a not very well-known scientist, chemist, organic chemist called Tibor Ganti, a Hungarian organic chemist who passed away, I think about 20 years ago, and a little bit less. And we decided to use his methodology, which he used for understanding minimal life, in order to understand minimal consciousness. Now, what did Ganti do when he thought about life? He compiled a list of capacities that are minimally sufficient for characterizing the mode of being in which he was interested, which was life. We are interested in consciousness, right? But he was interested in life. Then he specified the relations between these capacities, because it's not enough just to have a list. It's like a shopping list, right? It's not enough. We need to understand the relationship between the different capacities, this minimal list of capacities. And then he identified a marker, a property, such that when he had evidence of it, he knew that the kind of transition from non-life to life has gone to completion. That we are no longer, that yes, these creatures, if they have this property, they are alive. And this means that they have also the whole list of properties that we started with. And if this is the case, then we know that the creature, in his case, that the being is alive. And then if we understand this, when we look at this property, we can reverse engineer from this property to the system that enables it. Okay? And this we call it the evolutionary transition marker. So here is, so before I go into the transition marker, I want to tell you what the capacities are that he was talking about. He was talking about maintenance of the boundary, metabolism, stability, information storage, regulation of the internal media, growth, reproduction, and death. He said if we meet something like this, with these capacities, on a different planet, we know this creature is probably alive. And then he built a small model, which he called the chematon, which showed the relationships between these capacities, and he found a marker, a transition marker, which was for him unlimited heredity. Unlimited heredity is the capacity to form lineages of open-ended length And they can be short, they can be long, and varying in open-ended ways on the initial system. So there are many variations, many more variations than the organism or the lineage can ever meet in its own history. And the DNA-based heredity system that we have on Earth is a very good example of such unlimited heredity. But we can think about other systems like this. So the basic idea is this: the idea of the marker. We start with a list of capacities. This list of capacities, we say, are minimally sufficient for characterizing a mode of being. In the case of life, of Gandhi, what Gandhi was interested in is minimal life. And then, these are the list of capacities that are sufficient. And then we look for something, for a capacity that if it exists, it requires that all the list of capacities is in place, and therefore it marks this mode of being. Okay, this is the logic of our approach. This is the methodology. Okay, we can argue with the methodology, but we think it is a reasonable, common sense kind of a methodology that people can understand and work with. So this is what Gandhi did in the case of life. He had a list of capacities that are minimally sufficient for a living system, and we have. He found a marker, unlimited heredity, that if it exists, it requires this or this, and therefore marks this mode of being. And the evolutionary marker for life, he said, is something like something that allows open-ended heredity. And if you reverse engineer from it, he said, you will reach something like a minimal cell, something that like a protocell, something very primitive, but has all the capacities that he listed. Okay, so here it is. Okay. This is the general picture. So we said, okay, let's take this idea and implement it for the case of consciousness. Now, I want to explain to you what consciousness means for us. Consciousness means the ability to have experiences, even very minimal. I'm talking about minimal consciousness. I'm not talking about understanding, crying when you hear a concerto by Beethoven. I don't mean this. I don't mean also the ability to read philosophy and to listen to my lecture. I don't mean any of these things. I don't mean the capacity for language. I mean the minimal capacities, like being able to feel something, being able to perceive something, have an experience of seeing, of smelling, of hearing, of pain, of pleasure, the feeling of the body when it moves, when it doesn't move. It also includes things like remembering and the feelings that come with the remembering. It also includes intellectual kinds of states of being, of cognitive states. It includes all those. But the minimal consciousness is very simple. It is the ability to sense, to perceive, to sense, to perceive in the here and now. It requires quite a lot. It sounds very simple. When somebody kicks us and we feel pain, we think this is very, very simple. But it is very complex, really. It is actually what is behind this ability to feel anything. Anything is something very complex. Think about machines. You know, we have machines that can play chess and can beat the greatest masters in the world. But we don't have machines like this because feeling is a lot more complicated than this kind of rational operations. A lot more complicated and requires a lot more. Many different things have to be in place in order for this to happen. So we said, okay, let's adopt the methodology of Gandhi and let's go and let's try to understand what it entails, what it is. And let's start with a list of capacities. What are the capacities that psychologists, neurobiologists, cognitive biologists, philosophers of mind, philosophers of biology, the psychologists of all kinds of brands, behaviorists, non-behaviorists, whatever. will agree that are minimally sufficient to characterize consciousness. Let's go to the best of the literature that we have on this subject and compile something like a list, a consensus list, which will be minimal, but nevertheless will be sufficient for people to assume that if we have such a thing, then this a being with these capacities is possibly, we cannot ever be absolutely sure, but is possibly conscious, and therefore we should treat it with respect and concern. It has a welcome. So what are the capacities that we singled out? Again, it's all taken from a lot of literature that we read over the years. So we were talking about the capacity for perceiving something as a whole, as a totality. For example, we perceive the atom as a coherent whole. It is green, it is round, it is smooth. We can see both the totality of it as a total, as a coherent whole, and also the properties. So we do both analysis and synthesis at the same time. This is something very simple that we take for granted, but this is something that is very, very characteristic of conscious states. Another thing is something that is called global accessibility and broadcast. This kind, the necessity, and all of these capacities, by the way, are related and partially overlapping. So the integration among sensory, motor, memory, and value subsystems enable generalization, discrimination, and so on. So, for example, if you see suddenly a puma sitting in your sitting room, yes, you react to the puma. You see it. You react with fear, and the fear is based on a lot of things. What you know about pumas, what you know about what you see, about the whole context that you take and you react to this, and let's say you run away and close the door. So it leads to some kind of action. And so there is memories, there is integration among all these things. Between the memory, what you have to do, what you see, what you remember, and so on. Now, when creatures are conscious, we think about what it means to be in the world and to perceive it. There is a bombardment of stimuli at the time. You hear me now and you concentrate on what I'm saying, but this is not a trigger that you concentrate. There are lots of other things. There are lots of people here. It's hot or not so hot for some people. It's you feel a lot of things. There are lots and lots and lots of stimuli that bombard you, even now, even in this environment. Of course, in natural environment, many more. But nevertheless, you listen to me. You concentrate. There is an exclusion of a lot of stimuli. You are not aware of many, many stimuli around you unless I tell you about it. And I focus your attention on it. So the focusing of attention is very, very important, and it means that there must be processes of exclusion of a lot of information that is coming in and amplification of some of the information that is coming in. This kind of selective attention and the kind of channeling of experiencing is something that we are also very, very aware of. We cannot be experiencing at the same time. We experience a very rich world, but we experience it in a serial kind of manner, one after the other. This is again something that we take for granted, but it should not be taken for granted. It's very important. Another point that is fundamental is something that philosophers call intentionality. What they mean by intentionality is something that they call the boundless, so that there is a reference when creatures are conscious, they have some kind of representation of the world. The world is not directly accessible, but it is interpreted in some kind of way. There is some form of representation, some form of mapping of the world into our brain. The mapping that we have as human beings is not exactly the same as the mapping that an octopus has of the world, even if we're both in water, for example. So this is also something very important, that although we perceive a lot of things, we perceive them through very specific channels and through very specific interpretation systems. Yes? There is also another property that is very important, and this is temporal integration. the present, what we perceive at the present is not an infinitely small intersection between past and future. It has duration. There is duration. There is a depth to every present moment. And this is also part of what we could see as consciousness. And then there is a flexible evaluation system and goals that we have as conscious beings. So something is bad here. We don't react always in the same way. Sometimes something when you see a puma, when it is in the cage, you don't react with panic, right? You react in a very different way. So in this condition, it's like this, and in this condition, it is like that. And something is sometimes good, and sometimes it is bad, and sometimes it is neutral. And you can have a lot of feelings about it. All this flexibility is something that is characteristic of conscious being. And then we also have kind of agential embodiment. There is a kind of ability not only to learn about the world around us, but also about ourselves and our motor responses to this world. There is not only learning about the world, but also about the self. And in order to learn about the self, there must be some kind of freedom of action and some kind of control of action that we're able to do. Otherwise, we would behave like robots without this kind of flexible control. And then there is also something very important, which is the distinction between the self and the other from a stable perspective. Because we are bombarded, as I said, by stimuli, and we have to evaluate them all the time, and we have to make a distinction between ourselves and the world. So think about it, for example, when you tickle yourself and you're tickled by somebody else, it's the same stimulus, but you react very differently, right? So there is a kind of distinction between self and others, which is because we are beginning to understand the mechanisms involved, and it comes from a stable kind of perspective, which allows us to prioritize different things and to have a common denominator. Now, this is the list that we compile, and we say, if we found on another planet a creature with this capacity, we would think that it is plausible, not certainly, but it is plausible that it is conscious. Okay? And I think that there would be a general consensus about, people can argue about some of the aspects here, but no, there is no language here. There is no metacognition. Imagination is not mentioned. So it's not something that it is a complex list. It is a complex capacities, but they are not the capacity that characterize us, for example, as human beings. Okay. So we looked for something that we can call a transition marker. Now, okay, we have the list. How can we connect the dots? How can we connect these capacities to something? It was very, very difficult, and we decided to go in a different way. So we decided to start from the transition marker, okay? To find the capacity that requires that this whole list that I showed you before, this one, is in place. And after 1 year of hard work, we found something that seemed to work for us. We made a lot of mistakes. And we went into a lot of blind alleys, a lot. And we thought that we got it, and we didn't get it. And it was very frustrating, but also it was like you're trying to find your way in a territory that you don't really, so you get lost in it. But in the end, we came to something that seemed to satisfy us, at least for the time being. Maybe we'll find something better one day, or you will find something better one day. But this is what we got to. We got to something that we call the unlimited associative learning. And this is unlimited, not in the mathematical sense. Of course, it is limited in terms of mathematics. It's not everything. It's not an infinity, but it's unlimited in the sense that there's more combination than the stars in heaven. Okay, and the kind so that it allows a lot of to learn many different things. So we found something, a property. Our marker is a certain learning capacity. And this learning capacity is unlimited associative learning. Now, what is this unlimited associative learning? How do we characterize it? It allows the creature to distinguish among novel composite patterns of stimuli and actions. For example, find many routes, different routes to some food, and distinguish between more desirable and less desirable mates, for example. And these patterns are not reflex eliciting patterns. They are not something that you immediately react to because you have to compare, right? So it's something that you have to learn about, and they have not been learned in the past. So if you have the ability to distinguish between, to learn online as you see things in this kind of way, and then also to remember and use your memory for doing this kind of discrimination, this is one capacity of UAA. We need all four, right? Second, it is the capacity to learn about the predictor of reward or punishment, even if there is a time gap between the predictor and the reinforcement. This is called, in psychology, trace conditioning. And it requires that the memory of the neutral predictive stimulus is stored even when the reinforcing stimulus is, for some time, transiently unperceived. So there is a bell, let's say, that tells you that food is coming, and you react, but there is a gap, a time gap between the sound of the bell and the smell of the food. And nevertheless, you can learn, even if there is a time. Not all animals can do it, as I will come to it later. Another thing is that we can change the value of a learned pattern very flexibly. So sometimes something is good, sometimes same thing is bad, sometimes it is neutral, and we can sometimes this is better, A is better than B, and sometimes B is better than A, and sometimes C is even better than both A and B, and so on and so on. So this kind of capacity, and you can do trade-offs. You can decide to do A because you don't want B to happen, for example. So this is another ability which is very important. And this allows for something that we call, that people call goal-directed behavior. One that the creature, you can assume that the creature has some kind of beliefs about incentives. And also to manifest second-order learning, which means that you can learn on once you learn something in this kind of way, you can learn on the basis of something else. So you can build a chain of learning, or you can transfer from one modality to another modality. So this is the characterization of unlimited associative learning as we characterize it. Because we invented this term, and therefore we have the freedom to define it. Okay, and here is how we describe the system. Yes, it's a very important. This is the basic scheme that you saw, and the thing is that and what you see is that what you see is that the unlimited associative learning is actually a system property, right? There is not, so what we did now, we said, okay, let's see how we can describe this capacity. So we tried to identify the connections between the different aspects, not of minimal consciousness, but of unlimited associative learning, which is the marker of consciousness. Okay, this is how we approach the problem of making a model, because we couldn't model directly minimal consciousness. We couldn't do what Ganti did for the case of life. So we went around the problem by modeling unlimited associative learning. And what is important to understand and we realize what we have to show in this model is that there must be integration of sensory features that form some kind of compound configuration of the world, of the body, of the action, and of their relations that enable discrimination and generalization and transfer and all these complicated things. There must be some hierarchical mapping of the world and the body and action, and action-generated stimuli into updatable representations of the world. And why hierarchical? Because we don't have an infinite system of representation. Yes, I mean, in theory, then we don't need hierarchy, or if you have an infinite system, but system infinite. And there must be exclusion of irrelevant signals, and there must be focusing mechanisms, there must be an evaluative system that takes all the different stimuli and prioritizes them. And there must be an ability to distinguish between body-generated and world-generated stimuli. And not just reflective, not only things that are reflexive reactions, but also learned reactions. So here is this is our very, 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 very simple toy model. We have something more complicated, but I will not go into it. And it shows the connections between sensory unit, motor units, integrated kind of reinforcement units where you do the prioritization and the evaluation, and a memory unit which stores representations of wholes and parts. And it all has to come together. So the kind of dynamics that you see here is the dynamics, we believe, of unlimited associative learning, and in living organisms, this is also the dynamics of minimal consciousness. And I must say, this is a very general scripted model, of course. This is not the kind of computational model. It's not a computational model. We are not there yet. I think there are people who are trying to work and build computational model of something like UAL. But it's very interesting because some of the models of that people are trying to build today of the high artificial intelligence have some properties that are similar to this model. It's very interesting. And if you want, I will go to another presentation of mine and show you the similarity later in the question and answer, if we get to that. Okay, so we have the URL model is a very general model at the moment, a descriptive model of the evolutionary marker. It is required for biological implementation of minimal consciousness. And I'm saying biological. We don't say that implementation of UAL in any system, non-biological system, will yield consciousness. This is not our claim. We are talking about consciousness as we know it. And at the moment, the only consciousness that we know is biological consciousness. However, if we find some kind of UAL capacity in a machine, which we don't have, by the way, we're very far from it, it will be very interesting to understand what's going on in this machine. And we will have to start thinking that, you know, maybe there is something that we have to recognize and think about, although, if we again get to it, I will explain why I think that the embodiment and ontogeny are very important for consciousness as we know it. Now, what UAL does, what unlimited associative learning does, is it enables goal-directed behavior that involves recognition of predictive relations between complicated, made of many, many parts, gestalt kind of things, sensory inputs, action patterns, outcomes, and rewards. This is what it enables. So its functions, it's a very, very important function. It allows learning incredible, it's incredible strategy of learning that allows creatures that have this capacity to adapt to many, 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 many different environments in a very flexible way during their lifetime, not during evolution, during their lifetime. Now, this leads us to a question that has bothered philosophers of biology and philosophers of mind and philosophers of consciousness for a very long time. What is the function of consciousness? Yes, if it's not just input-output kind of response, what is it? Why can't it feel it? And according to this theory, the function of consciousness is to create a new realms of goals that wouldn't exist otherwise. It enables the organism to make flexible, context-dependent decisions and reach goals that are based on composite, learned, predictive perception and actions, action outcomes, motivation, and past and present effects. This is a long definition, not very elegant. The person who gave it a really elegant kind of articulation was William James, great philosopher of the 19th century, that wrote a very important book on psychology, the principles of psychology, which is focus on consciousness. And in the world of William James, who influenced us, consciousness is a fighter for ends, of which many, but for its present, would not be ends at all. And it exactly fits our more complicated definition, comes from our hypothesis that the driving force for the evolution of consciousness and the characterizing dynamics of consciousness are those of analytic associative learning. And what you see here are two types of flowers. One flower is pollinated by wind, and another flower is pollinated by insects, in this case, not the firefly. Dragon. It escaped before. A dragonfly. So what is the difference? The wind-pollinated flowers doesn't have any color. The nectar doesn't have any sugar. It doesn't have any smell. Well, not very surprising. The wind does not smell. The wind does not see. And the wind does not taste. On the other hand, the dragonfly can see, can taste, and can make discrimination based on taste, on visual patterns, and so on. So there was evolution of flowers who are not themselves, according to our theory, just conscious, who have these patterns because of the selection by a conscious being like a dragonfly, which already tells you something about how we think, what we think about that. We think that dragonflies are conscious, but we'll come to this very soon. And here is again another way of looking at it, or saying the same thing, is attaining a desired goal, in this case a good mate, using visual patterns as criteria. The female, the little gray thing there, ability to discriminate and choose among subtly different males. I mean, she is scrutinized, then she looks at this, not so good, this one, not better, this one, yes, I like it. And this ability to discriminate led to the complicated and beautiful patterns of the male of the body. So Darwin, by the way, regarded this kind of mate selection as evidence for mental capacities. And the female, according to him, has, according to Darwin, I'm citing him, has a taste for the beautiful. Very interesting. Now, let's go back a little bit. Okay, we have criteria, unlimited associative learning, and we want to understand who among the living creatures that we recognize is conscious and who is not. Or at least who is conscious, who has unlimited associative learning. So Simona and I went to the literature, learning literature, 150 years of learning literature, and went through it as well as we could. Asking many colleagues from different countries to translate for us from Russian, from German, from, you name it, Spanish too. All kinds of papers in order for us to see what the learning literature tells us. What about something like unlimited associative learning or proxies for unlimited associative learning. That is, properties of learning that indicate something like unlimited associative learning, even if it's not exactly what we want. And what we found was that the literature told us that all vertebrates seem to have it. I don't have to tell you what vertebrates are, and sometimes I have to tell to some audiences. So they have it. Some arthropods have it. And a group of mollusks, the coloring mollusks, cephalopods, the octopuses, squid, and the cuttlefish have it. We didn't find evidence for it in other groups. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, because one of the things we found not very surprisingly, is that there are huge holes in our knowledge. There are lots of things we simply don't know because nobody knows. So what we say is only about what we do know, not about what we don't know. We know that in this group of dynamics, we can say there is unlimited associative learning, and therefore we believe that according to we infer from this that minimal consciousness exists in these groups. That's all we can say. Okay, next stage. So we have an idea of the distribution of unlimited associative learning and by implication of minimal consciousness. It's a positive number, not a negative one. Okay, I'm stressing. Okay, then we said fine. We know that in order to implement this kind of learning, we need something like, as I showed you in the model before, yes, in this model, we need a center for motor integration, a center for sensory integration, memory, some kind of integrated memory, some kind of integrated piece. Evaluation system, and somewhere where all these things come to peace. Okay? So there must be brain, these creatures have brains. There must be brain areas which implement this, right? If we're right, we should find in the brains of members of these groups. Yes, this is what this has to be. And we did find it. Although the brains of mammals, for example, vertebrates in general, and of insects and of cephalopods are very, very different, they do have the basic functional organization that we see in the basic functional units that are required for unlimited associative learning. And so here you have a picture that was, it's a figure by a well-known entomologist, somebody who studies neurobiology of insects, who shows the similarity with two people, Strauss and Pearce. They saw the deep homology of the arthropod central complex and the vertebrate basal ganglia. And although the brains are totally different, the units and the functional interactions between them, you don't have to go into the details, just have the look are similar, right? It's very amazing. Doesn't necessarily mean that they have a common origin, that this kind of capacity, that there is a common ancestor, maybe, but it could also be parallel evolution. We are not sure about it. So now we know. And we have fossils, and fortunately, we also have fossils of brains, not many, because brains are soft, and they don't usually fossilize very well, but in some conditions they do, or they leave enough traces for people to be able to reconstruct. So we went to the fossil record. And when in the fossil record did these brains allow unlimited associative learning first evolve? And here is what we found: that brains with capacities that are able to support unlimited associative learning appear in two groups during the Cambrian. The Great Cambrian explosion 542 million years ago, right? In the vertebrates and in the arthropods. In the coleoid cephalopods, we find this brains 250 million years ago. This group evolved 250 million years later. Sorry, later, not ago, later. Okay? So what we know is that you have unlimited associative learning, and by implication, minimal consciousness evolved at least twice in the vertebrates and the arthropods, and then later in the cephalopods, or possibly 3 times in parallel, at more or less at the same time in arthropods and in vertebrates and in cephalopods later. Okay, so very interesting and very satisfying. Why satisfying? Because the Cambrian explosion is where the animal lives suddenly there was this, that's why it's called explosion, Cambrian explosion. Everything sort of appeared in a relatively short geological time. From geological perspective, 50 million years is short, right? We're not talking about a few years, but nevertheless, it's very, very rapid. for us evolutionary biologists. When I say 50 million years to non-biologists, they don't understand why I'm saying this is wrong. And they think I'm crazy. And so here we are. So what is it? And what we see when we look at the fossil records of the Cambrian, we see a lot of creatures, but we can infer that there were a lot of interactions between these creatures, both antagonistic interactions, prey-predator kind of interactions, and also cooperative interactions. Probably sexual selection and stuff like this began to happen very, very rapidly. We don't know much about sexual selection, more about predation, because we see creatures with all of the tools for preying on other creatures, and a lot of animals with all the adaptations of defense against predators, right? So there was a big war of nature happening during the Cambrian explosion. And we believe that it was during this period that we saw that unlimited associative learning evolved. Associative learning evolved a little bit before, and it drove the Cambrian explosion. It's not only an expression of what happened during the Cambrian explosion, but it is because it is such an adaptation. Anybody who has this ability will estimate anything else unless there's very rapidly evolved some way of, very clever animals. They are dangerous animals. They will eat you. And so you have to be clever, or you have to find some other intelligent ways to avoid them. And also to interact, the creature suddenly can make discrimination. So this is good, this snake is good, this snake is bad. Suddenly there are all kinds of, a whole new world opens. So lots of interactions become possible, and we believe that unlimited associative learning also was one of the drivers of the Cambrian explosion. It wasn't the only thing that allowed the Cambrian explosion. Of course not. There are many, many things that came together in order for the great explosion to happen. But we believe that the evolution of learning, of this type of learning especially, was a very important driving force. So, what happened there? What happened during the Cambrian? We know that there was an increase in oxygen levels during the Cambrian. And there was an increase, not huge increase, but small increase, but an increase which is significant, allowing big bodies to evolve. Right? If you have no oxygen, which is a very, very good source of energy, you cannot have very big bodies. But there was an increase in oxygenation that allowed this. There was increased nutrient cycles and productivity that were due to methane release from global warming that occurred during this period. And as a result of that, there was flooding of continental margins, changes in ocean constitution that allowed for biomineralization. So calcium, yes, calcification, for example. And all this also allowed growth in size during the Cambrian. And this growth in size necessarily leads to a selection for integration of sensory inputs and motor coordination. You have more sensory units, right? You have a bigger body, you have more cells in your for example, eyes or whatever it is, and you have more muscle sheets. So you have to be able to coordinate. So there must have been selection for coordination, motor coordination, and sensory integration, and for the creature to engage in movement, in productive burrowing, in productive swimming. And predation, we've exerted a very intense and continuous selection for sensory multi-level integration. And it led to the kind of architecture that we recognize as the Gurión architecture, not only predation, but also cooperation. So we believe that there was an evolution from limited kind of associative learning, which preceded Gurión, to unlimited associative learning. There was integrated sensory. There was sensory system evolved, allowing sensory discrimination. There was the motor system evolved, allowing motor coordination, and there must have been also the build-up, the construction, the evolution of dedicated memory system, motor sensory association areas, and reinforcement system that can lead to prioritization that is integrated into. And what is interesting about this, very evident from everything that we know about animals, is that the motor system and the nervous system co-evolve. With one exception, all animals that have nerves also have muscles. There is one exception, and this is a parasitic cnidaria, the Maxozoa. That's it. So this tells us something about the importance of movement in the evolution of learning and of consciousness. So we think that the Cambrian was when unlimited associative learning and minimal consciousness evolved. This was also the period in which we see the origins of joy and of suffering. And so before there was selection, there was life, but there was no joy, there was no suffering. And here is something very interesting by Aristotle. In the first paragraph of Metaphysics 1, Aristotle says the following: all men by nature desire to know. An indication of this is the delight we take in our senses. For even apart from their usefulness, they are loved for themselves, and above all others, the sense of sight. For not only with a view to action, but even when we are not going to do anything, we prefer seeing, one might say, to everything else. And this is the important point here. The reason is that most of the senses, makes us know and brings to light many differences between things. So what Aristotle is trying to tell us is that the joy, that knowledge and joy are connected. Knowledge, the ability to know, brings us joy because it is so adaptable. The adaptable I'm adding is an evolutionary biologist. He didn't say that, right? But of course, knowledge is good for our soul. Yes, knowledge is good. So agency and exploration are joyful. The ability to learn through agency, through exploration, through exploring the world and exploring one's own action is good because it brings knowledge, and knowledge is adaptable. So a system that makes learning joyful would evolve, right? So this is the origin of joy. Again, it's connected to the ability to learn. However, learning also has a dark side, and knowledge has a dark side. And here is another quotation. For in much wisdom there is much grief, and he that increases knowledge increases sorrow. And this is from Ecclesiastes, the Old Testament. The more you know, the more you suffer. This is also true. Now, suffering is very difficult to endure. It is a cost. This is a cost of consciousness. It's a heavy cost. But it is selectively advantageous. Why do I say people who don't have the ability to feel pain die young? They have all kinds of injuries and they simply die. That's it. Because they are not aware that they broke something. They are not aware of, and most of them are, it's very difficult to take care of such people. So they die young. So the ability to feel pain is a very important protective mechanism. However, the ability to learn by associating in this unlimited associative learning means that we very often are neurotic. We are afraid of things, even if we have studied, it's not necessarily clear that the kind of thing we're afraid of will necessarily lead to something disastrous. This is something that, for example, you see smoke and you think there is fire when you run away. You see smoke in your house, yes? Now, sometimes it's the smoke detector principle. You're afraid of something because sometimes, even rarely, it can lead to a disaster. And if it leads to the disaster, you can lose your life. And if you can lose your life, that's it. Finish with it. So better be cautious and neurotic than be just be, happy go, this kind of happy and comfortable in your life. Better open your eyes, even if you're wrong. Even if favor of, although you spend energy and you spend, but on the other hand, if you are too neurotic, it's not good because you become sick, right? So you must be able also to forget. And we believe that the evolution of forgetting is related to the evolution of suffering. And it is a partial mechanism that allows us to cope with the overlearning that we often find in a sense. It's not a perfect solution. We are always, the smoke detector principle always works, but there was evolution of mechanisms of stress reduction that appeared during evolution in order to cope with too much learning and too much neurosis. So there are two sides to this learning: the joyful side that Aristotle talked about, and the suffering aspect that Ecclesiastes was telling us about. Now, a good model must have testable predictions. It's another, we see unlimited associative learning as another cluster in the sense that the different elements must group together in animal societies. And this predicts that the development, the ontogeny of one element will facilitate or enable the development of one or more of the other elements. So there will be a connection between them during development. Then there will be also a connection between them during evolution. So if you find a species in which there is one element of the unlimited associative learning complex, which is first conditioning, discrimination learning, second order learning, and trade-offs and evaluation, flexible evaluation, there is a good possibility that the others are also in place. Okay, if one is in place, there's a good, it is plausible, more than by chance. And brain injuries that affect one element will not leave the other elements completely unaffected, but leave more limited forms of learning unaffected. So if you have, if one form of learning of unlimited associative learning is affected by some kind of brain lesion or something like that, it will have repercussion on other capacities of unlimited associative learning. But most simplest forms of learning will be in place, no problem. Okay. Oh, why? What do I have to do? Let's try it. Hey. Okay. Sorry for this. This is very to the prediction that experimental protocols like backward masking. You know what backward masking is? It's when you show a picture, and for example, on the screen, and like computer screen, and before this picture, or after this picture, you have a kind of noisy kind of image, like black and white kind of noisy thing that doesn't mean anything. And masking, and what happens is that if you show the picture of that is informative, let's say a blue flower or something like that, or a landscape or a face or whatever, and if, for a short time before that or after that you show the mask, the person will, a human being will say, I didn't see anything. Didn't see. That's it. And what we say is what we so it is, but if you look at the brain of this person, you see that something is happening there. There is some processing of information, but it doesn't go all the way. So if the person you make him or her guess, you show them all kinds of flowers, blue, red, yellow, I don't know, white, whatever, and you say, well, what did you see? The person will say, I didn't see anything, right? Nothing. Yes, I will say, but guess. And many people will guess that it was the blue flower, right? Although they are not aware that they saw it, right? Now, so we know about this kind of phenomenon. It's kind of unconscious kind of recognition, and there are also unconscious forms of learning. According to our theory, unlimited associative learning cannot happen under masking conditions. It will not be possible to learn the complicated things that we are requiring, for example, trace conditioning, to learn them well, or discrimination, complex discrimination learning, and so on, under masking conditions. Now, this has been shown to be the case already in humans. Humans cannot learn the UAA kind of task without, when they are unaware, when you show that this, when you are masking, okay, they cannot do it. With other animals, there are very, very few experiments. Some experiments in monkeys, and people have done some experiments in bees. And the experiments so far support what we anticipated. This experiment didn't exist before we wrote the book. In other animals, but we said if we're right, it must be the case, not only in humans, where there are also very few experiments, by the way, but also in other animals. And this is in fact the case. And we also expect that people with, for example, something that is called blind sight, which is again a lesion in the brain that leads a person being blind, saying, I don't see anything, or I don't see anything, but nevertheless be able to navigate, for example, in a room with all kinds of obstacles, in spite of the fact that the person is saying, I don't see anything. You can do it to some extent. We say that there will be tasks that these people will not be able to do. And this task will be UAL tasks. This has not been yet examined, but it is a prediction of the moment. And we also expect that the neural signatures of experience, of subjective experience, whatever they turn out to be, will also be correlated with UAL, with unlimited associative learning. So if we will find the neural correlates of minimal consciousness, this will be also the neural correlates of unlimited. We expect this. This will also be done now. Now, I just want to say very, very few words about the relationship of our model to other models. Since I have about 4 minutes, yes, I would be very, very quick. So our model is in some way similar to a very popular model of consciousness, which is the global workspace model, GNW. In Europe, the global neural workspace model. And here it is. It is on the left, you see the GNW, the global neural space, and you see the familiar model of ours. And what it shows is that there is a similarity in terms of the kind of units that are necessary for consciousness, although in our model we specify the relations in a much more specific way. This is the model on the left, the GW model is very, very general model at this level. Now, what I did with my student Orion Sachs. We tried to, the JW model was described in humans and in higher primates. And the JW model and the UAA model, our model, have very specific assumptions and predictions about the neural implementation and the behavior of the animals that will have it. You heard about our model, but the JW model also has very specific predictions. So although this model was built on humans, we look to see, and since we say, not the people who developed the JW model say, but we say this model is also applicable to all vertebrates, including fish, right? Then we expect to find this testable predictions, this assumptions to be valid not only for humans. So we looked at fossil fish, and the most primitive fish. There are several here is a phylogenetic tree, and you see all kinds of fish there. We mainly have, you see the tiny million years, you see different vertebrates, but mainly we concentrated here on fish. So we looked at basic fish, the most primitive in each lineage. And we looked at and there are comparisons of the brains of fish and of humans. And so, of course, they have very similar. There's a lot of homology, which is not surprising because we are vertebrates, and we are derived from fish. They don't have a neocortex, but they have something that is called the telencephalon, the frontal kind of part of the brain that has some properties of the neocortex, and what we looked for was for the properties of what we were trying to focus on was where does the integration between sensory units that we all understand that we know fish have, the memory units that we know that fish have, the motor units that we know that fish have, the reinforcement units that we know that fish have. Where is the integration happening? And what we found was very, very interesting. We found that the hippocampus, which is the part of the brain which is doing the memory, in fish, it is also the place where everything comes together. So the hippocampus, the memory system, the declarative memory system, is having two jobs, is doing two jobs, which later in evolution got separated into separated memory and then to the neocortex. But in fish, there is the hippocampus is doing the two jobs. So we have to change the model, both our model and their model. So our model now says that in the beginning, in vertebrates at least, in early vertebrates, the hippocampus was the place that played the role of the integration of the integrated system. And this must be the case also for the JW. It's very, very interesting, and we came to this conclusion because I will not go into the analysis that we made because it's a long analysis, and but it is based on the properties, known properties from neurophysiology of what is going on in the hippocampus of fish, which is called the HH homologue, the hippocampus homologue. So it's a very interesting thing, and it tells us something about the relationship between memory and consciousness. And this also has predictions. And I just want to finish with two points. I was talking only about minimal consciousness. I didn't talk about imaginative consciousness, about the ability to plan, for example, and to feel about something that you remember, and to feel about something that you envisage in the future, and all these things. Some animals can plan and can have this kind of capacity. So consciousness evolved, didn't stay at this basic stage. So past memories and future possibilities can be conscious in some animals. Not many animals, we don't know very well the distribution. We're trying, our project now with Orion Sachs is to try and map this as well as we can. And then we have also our consciousness, our reflective consciousness. There's the ability to think and to, in a way that goes beyond the thinking and feeling of our other animals, to have values, to have kind of symbolic values that drive and change not only our cognitive abilities, but also our emotional abilities and also our perceptions. Because having this symbolic system has profound influence on our mode of being in experience. So this is Levi-Montalcini, great scientist, and Rita Levi-Montalcini, great scientist, who is our example here of a person with drawn, of course, by another. So the conclusions here. What I presented to you is an evolutionary approach to minimal consciousness, which was modeled on Dante's approach. I describe consciousness as a simple property that is constituted and entailed by a particular form of cognition, cognition that allows the main general, open-ended, generative representation of kind of learning, associative learning, and it allows goal-directed behavior. It requires we think that it requires a central nervous system, and it is present only in some animals, not in all animals, we think. Of course, this is open to discussion and to dispute, and it requires quite a lot in terms of the processes, neural processes required, that we believe that the evolution of analytic associative learning drove the evolution of consciousness, and it evolved in different types of nervous systems to different extents. And the function of biological consciousness is to generate a new realm of goals that are contingent with the satisfaction of prioritized physiological needs. And tasks can be achieved only when an organism is conscious. Thank you very much. And I want to finish. Under this front is written in the book that we just, the kind of picture book that we presented, which also presents a more accessible approach to this whole set of ideas, and goes also beyond that. Theories pass, the frog remains. Thank you.
Bueno, pues agradecemos mucho a Eva esta conferencia. Tenemos tiempo para preguntas y tengo, espero, dos micrófonos funcionales. En dado caso, vamos a pasarnos allí. Sí. Haré, quienes quieran hacerlas en español, puedo hacer un esfuerzo por coincidir, pero están muy bien.
Well, thank you very much for your great conference. I really enjoyed it. About the inputs and just running on imagination, I want to say that I'd like to add that human imagination, at least, is limited to restricted to our senses, right? I hope it makes sense. You know, if our imagination were that great, we'd be able to picture or imagine things way beyond what we can conceive with our senses, whatever it is, maybe chiefly the eyes, right? But sometimes imagination, well, actually imagination, therefore, the another level can be inconsistent, the another higher level can be conceptual, right? It's a paradox about learning too, right?
I'm not sure I understood the question. What is paradox?
If human imagination, first of all, is restricted to our senses, then it's inconsistent, then it's conceptual. So we can actually understand that we should see we should personalize it, but in order to personalize, we should see that. Well, notice that we don't consent. So from how we don't consent to a conscience and vice versa, that's a paradox right here, in my opinion.
I'm not sure whether I understand your question.
Again?
Maybe it's found in the systems.
Slower. All right. First of all, human imagination is restrained to our senses.
Right. Human imagination is I agree.
And therefore, as well as it implies obviously that our brains are not yet evolved enough to be able to conceive things that we haven't perceived, right? Of course, we first of all need to also really part of that stimuli, like what we see, for example, I see you, I feel like I'm wearing this, etc., right? But the imagination can be inconsistent, and therefore, because of our limited inputs, right? That's a higher level, but the higher level we may tell that human imagination is conceptual. Therefore, a paradox may be if it is strange to our senses, how can we really know it's conceptual, which is and vice versa? It's a little bit
I will try to answer if I'm not sure that I understood 100%, but I will try to answer nevertheless. So yes, we have limitations, sensory limitations, and also intellectual limitations. So there is a limit to what we can know, and there are levels also of sensory experience and intellectual conceptualizations in humans, for example, that we don't find, and it's not clear it's not entirely clear what the relationships between them are, right? So how can we sort of resolve this? This is what yes. So there are several things. First of all, yes, of course we are limited by our senses, and therefore our sensory experience is obviously very limited. There are lots of things, but there are many colors. For example, goldfish. You can see many more colors than witness. Yeah. And bumblebees can see not only bumblebees but other insects too. You see in the ultraviolet and so on. And echolocation is something that most of us cannot do, although we are capable. And so on and so forth. So there are many limitations there. Nevertheless, although there are many limitations on our senses, this is something that we can study in other animals and infer through their behavior and so on that this exists. And then we can try to implement it in our own brain. There are all kinds of cyborgs today, for example, where they have all kinds of chips in their bodies that allow them, for example, to sense the magnetic field of the Earth. Yes, I don't think the magnetic field of the Earth. I don't think that most of us here feel this, but we can. I mean, if you implement, if I put something under your skin with connected to your nervous system, it will work, and you will be able to navigate according to the magnetic field, like a pigeon. They have it naturally. So this kind of things can and it doesn't so one of the things we have to think about is about sensory richness. When we think about consciousness, we have to think about the richness of consciousness along the dimension of the sensory richness that animals are capable of. Some animals have more sensory richness, different sensory richness, less sensory richness, and so on. So this is a dimension of consciousness. And this is also how it is described in the literature. Then you also have the dimension of the ability to move. Some animals can move more flexibly than others. For example, I guess that the freedom of movement of an octopus is much greater than that we have here, right? And they can do things and feel their bodies in ways that are very different. And maybe their consciousness is more distributed than ours in some sense. So there is also the question of the unity of consciousness, how unified is consciousness, for example. And this is another dimension of consciousness that we have to study and understand in other animals, but be aware of it. And there's also the motor aspect of consciousness. How much agency does an animal have? How much control it has over its actions and so on? And this can be different. And we have also the memory system. How much memory, how much imagination animals have. This is another dimension of consciousness. So all the things I was talking about actually can be more or less. They can define a whole. There is a huge variability in the living world. But what we were trying to do, and this was our project, was to define a very minimal set of capacities with minimal sensory, with minimal agency, with minimal everything minimal, as minimal as we can, as possible. As Einstein said, You know, things have to be as simple as possible. Explanation theories have to be as simple as possible, but not simpler. Right? It's a great sentence. It's true. I mean, you can't simplify it. So I think that we have many limitations, but I think that the theory also allows us to be aware of our own limitations, both sensory and cognitive. And the relationship between cognition, between the conceptual aspect, and for example, the sensory aspect is very interesting. And I'll give you just one example. Okay, our linguistic ability is wonderful, of course, but it also has a price. And one of the prices is something that is called called perceptual masking. What does it mean? Let's say that you see a burglar going into a shop, and then you're asked to describe this burglar. And there are several people who saw this burglar, but you and another friend was asked to describe this burglar, and you say, well, it was like this, it was like that. And then you have a line of people and you have to identify the burglar. You and your friend will be worse in identifying the burglar than people who were not asked to describe it in words. So the words lead to a kind of, how shall I say, to simplification of perceptual experience, to the reduction of perceptual experience. This is one of the prices that we pay for our ability to learn. And there are other prices too, emotional prices. We pay a high emotional price for our symbolic ability because we can decouple feelings from thinking, from thoughts, which animals usually cannot do very well. They can do to some extent, not very well. I can tell you now about a frightening story, you will not run away. And maybe if I'm a good storyteller, you would be a little bit afraid, but not as afraid as if you saw the coma yourself sitting here and roaring at you. Right? So we have an ability of what evolved during the evolution of humans was a decoupling between symbolic, between the conceptual aspect and the emotional aspect. This is a very high price. And we see it allows us to do great things. Yes? Great things, but it also allows all the horrors. Because we can not feel, we can allow ourselves not to feel about other people. We can tell ourselves stories, also through the linguistic system, that will allow us to do horrible things, which other animals cannot do. So we pay a very, very, and so the relationship between emotions and the conceptual aspect in humans are very peculiar and I believe very human specific. Don't know if I answered the question, but I hope I did something.
Hello, I am Vadim. I'm from Minsk. So thank you very much for your talk. It's a pleasure to see you again. Yesterday. So my question is, you presented a minimal set of attributes of consciousness. So how was it chosen, this minimal set?
Right.
Another question, sorry. So was it acquired like all together at once or step by step? The question.
Okay, so good questions. And, right, the first question is that we sat for a more than a year and went through all the theories of consciousness that we were that were on the table. Okay, and also there were several of them. And also through philosophy of mind, the literature of the philosophy of mind and psychology, the kind of psychology that allow themselves to think about consciousness and write about it. And from this literature of psychologists, philosophers, neurobiologists, and people who specifically work on the neurobiology of consciousness studies, a field that began in the 1990s, right? Mid-1990s, yeah, I think mid-1990s, but it started a little bit before. So we read all the books that were available to us that were published in languages that we can read, and we compiled a list from all of them. Just a list. And we saw what was common to all of them. And what seemed like something that you cannot do without. You just, one by one. And it was not very surprising to see that they were convergent. Even if they were quarreling between themselves, like, I don't know, like the end of the world. Yes, sometimes there are terrible disputes among scientists, but then when you actually see what they say, they don't understand why they are disputing so much, because they have so much in common. It's like the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, they were the greatest enemies. Okay, so that's how we define this. By going through a very, very big set of theories and very, very dead studies, and trying to come to something, to a list that would be acceptable by all of them. But not the list that is necessarily specific to humans. This didn't interest us so much. We were not interested in humans in the first. So this is the first question. Second question, yes.
Just because now the minimal consciousness is associated with plants and slime mold.
Yes. No, it's according to our theory, it's not associated with plants. Okay? I'm sorry, I know that it is very popular to think that plants have consciousness, but I don't think that if you eat a cabbage, it suffers. I don't think so. And it's not because I don't think that the cabbage is a wonderful creature. I think it's wonderful. And I think that plants are incredible creatures. And I think that we lack a concept to describe what is going on at the system level in plants. We don't have a concept, but I don't think that sentience and consciousness are the right words to describe this. I do not think, from everything that we know, that they have the ability for joy and for suffering. Okay, so I don't think that they're conscious according to our theory. We may be wrong, but I do think that there is a conceptual gap in our understanding of the living world, that we don't know how to characterize it in a proper way. You cannot characterize plants like soft machines. They are not soft machines. Okay. But going back to your second question, did it all evolve at once or did it evolve step by step? It's a very difficult question. All I can say is when certain capacities of learning came together, this is when we had unlimited associative learning and minimal consciousness. I think that probably there was gradual evolution in some lineages. And you might ask me the next difficult question is, are they conscious or not? And I will tell you, I don't know. In the same way that I don't know if forms of chemical complexes that have a lot of the properties of life, but not all of them, are alive or not alive. I don't know. There is a gray area. And this gray area defies definition. It's very theory dependent. It defies definition. It defies definition not because we're stupid, but because we're evolutionary, but because of evolution. Because evolution is gradual, and it leads to these areas that you don't know how to define them. They are very interesting. They are possibly the most interesting for some people. Depends on your temperament. But they're very, very interesting. So I believe that there was gradual evolution, probably, but but at some point, and I think it came relatively quickly, these things enabled the evolution of one thing, enabled the evolution of another thing. So you have the cluster, and once you have the cluster, you can say, okay, that's it. Before that, I don't know.
Vamos a darle otra pregunta aquí del público. Tenemos dos preguntas desde el YouTube, la dinámica, estamos ahí tomando nota, y espero que ustedes hagan las preguntas más después. Bueno, gracias a todos por su participación. Alejandro,
I congratulate you very much. Very exciting. My first question, I will be fast. I am a physicist, I confess. So my question is very much related to the last question you just answered, which is the appearance of life seems to be a phase transition, a very stubborn although we discuss about virus, the one not the different. So it's a very stubborn. However, you say you follow the scheme of Tibor and others, which is called, they follow this to the final. And this is a very stubborn. However, consciousness seems to be clearly a very gradual evolution aspect of life. I mean, a cockroach, well, virus, then a bacteria, or a cockroach who seems to be very much aware and who reacts and mates and looks for food and seems to follow many of your definitions.
I think the cockroaches are conscious.
Are conscious. I mean the same thing. But, this is just, I mean, you already answered what you think about that. But my other question has to do with your many papers on the your previous work on the genetics. And it's in regard with what happened in this century, the appearance of a new, very important ingredient, which is the microbiome. And I want to know your opinion about this. Like, we have to look at ourselves as an ecological system and not an individual.
So first of all, about the suddenness of multiplication. So there are many threshold effects in evolution, by the way. So, you know, first of all, you have threshold effects. So things can evolve gradually. So when they come to a particular point, for example, two horns grow slowly like this, and then they cross. Once they cross, there is a default. Okay? And your physical properties, they can be used in a completely different way. For example. So there are threshold properties, and there is a question whether what happened during the evolution of consciousness was like a turn on the lights, and suddenly there is light, yes? Like in the Bible, or if it's a dimmer, like slowly, from something happens. First we don't know, and so we don't. So this is a question that. And I just want to tell you that even in the evolution of life, the origin of life, you say phase transition. Yes, people describe it as phase transition. Some people also describe the transition to consciousness as phase transition. But what is phase transition in terms of evolutionary biology? Yeah, several million years, right? It didn't happen in a day, the origin of life. There was a lot of chemical evolution before that. And you can also ask yourself, where do I define something that's alive or not alive in this complex chemical system? Is it enough to have a self-reproducing membrane and a little bit of RNA floating in it or not? Or do we need more complex metabolism, or don't we need complex metabolism, and so on? That's why Gandhi, when he was doing his list, he made the list very complicated, not too complicated, but complicated enough for something that he regarded as minimal life, which requires a focus. Okay, you can argue about it, and people do argue about it, and it's a legitimate kind of argument, but it begins already to depend very much on definitions. So I don't want to go into this too much, into the definition of things. I want to go to operationalize, to say, well, when can I say something in a way that will be testable, and that we will not sit here arguing from morning till evening about definitions. So in a way, it's a lazy way of doing it. It's not a very philosophical way of doing it, but I want to go beyond the definitional stage and find a consensus where we can go forward with this kind of question. And as I said before, there is a region. Each theory has a kind of gray area where you cannot. The theory is not able to tell you in a clear way whether the thing, how to define the system. You cannot do it. And as I said, it is not a bug; it's a feature. The second thing is what you asked about the microbiome. We are ecological systems. All of us, and so were the ancient animals that we were talking about. And we have to understand the complex ecological relationship. And we know, for example, that the microbiome affects not only obesity, and not only diseases, all kinds of metabolic diseases, but also cognition. We have evidence for this. And we need to understand more about the microbiome also of other animals, not just humans. And to understand it, because as I said, in the Cambrian, when all these forms of life evolved, I'm sure that the interaction that evolved were also symbiotic interactions, parasitic interactions, all kinds of interactions, and also, of course, interaction and a change and an enrichment in the microbiome must have had some kind of interest. But I cannot say very much about it because we know very too little about this kind of things in non-humans and in non-mammals. We know something, yes, we know something in ants and in termites and yes, we know something. We know more and more and more, but still it's very limited. So it's very important, but you know, the way it's very difficult for us to incorporate it into our evolutionary scenario, except saying, yes, this was a play.
Antes de dar paso para que pueda haber participación del público en estas modalidades híbridas, entonces damos para aquí algunas preguntas de YouTube. Son questions that are on the YouTube channel.
It's very interesting.
Yeah. I will put together 3 of them. So, what about patients that are not able to learn anymore? Do they really exist? And would you say they don't have UAL, but they are sentient? And what about babies? Do they have UAL since born, or there is a transition of the marker during our life? And finally, would you be open to consider the hippocampus-like structure in a fish is not homologous but analogous to the human hippocampus? I have seen reports saying this much.
So these are all very good questions, and from first of all, the hippocampus, it's called the hippocampus homolog in the literature. From many to be homologous. Now, from our point of view, it doesn't. We don't care terribly much if it is homologous or analogous. If it comes from a different embryonic origin or not comes from a different embryonic origin. What is important for us that it is that it acts in fish. So it seems to us both to the memory system and as a global neural workspace, and whether and this is the important point, whether or not it is and it's an interesting case, even if it is non-homologous. Just on that. As to the other questions. Very, very important. It's a very important question because what we are saying is that unlimited associative learning is an evolutionary mark. It is not an ontogenetic mark. And ontogeny does not recapitulate phylogeny in this case. So we cannot infer from ontogeny to phylogeny and vice versa in a very simple way. What we can do, of course, a baby is sentient. It is sentient because it has the architecture of UAL already in place by evolution through evolutionary development. When this architecture first appears during embryogenesis is an interesting question. And I will go back to it a little bit later. But first of all, we have to recognize that the baby that is awake, that is functioning, has an architecture of UAL already in place. Everything that it grasps through this architecture that evolved during evolution. And of course it is sentient. Of course, although in the beginning, what the baby perceived is blooming, buzzing, confusion. Right? In the first few minutes of its coming, of hours coming into the world, these are the words of William James, by the way. Blooming, buzzing, confusion. And it has to organize very quickly in his little brain what it sees into images, visual images, auditory images, smell, everything. Everything is confusion in the beginning, but it is experience because the machine for experiencing is there. Now, a person who is losing it, so people in deep coma, no, they're not conscious. But people who have some Some of the architecture of the UNA are conscious, although their consciousness is less rich than our consciousness. Obviously, they can't remember. Many of them lose a lot of sensory capacity, but they are sentient. Obviously, they're sentient. And God help us if we don't treat them like this. I want to tell you that people thought, even in the 1980s in the United States of America, people thought that babies were not conscious. And they operated on them, vivisection they did on them. They operated on them without giving them drugs, without anesthetizing them, okay? And, yeah, unbelievable, but this happened in the 20th century, right? No, in the 19th century, I don't want to talk about what was going on with the vivisection in animals. Right, so obviously, developmentally, with the evolution of unlimited social development leads to the death of animals that have the capacity for this kind of that have this protection for the human consciousness, which is operating, unless we are in very deep sleep or in coma. Then it is not operating. Now the question is, what happens in embryogenesis? So first of all, we have to ask the question: when do the structures appear during embryogenesis? And we have more or less a clue in different animals, more or less. And then we can also ask, is the animal, for example, deeply asleep or not? Because even if it has the structures and it is deeply asleep, then it will not feel anything, right? So these are the two questions about which we have to think and about which there is a lot of discussion, because of course they have ethical implications for abortion and stuff like that. But